So now we have a courageous anthropologist who entertained us yesterday. And it's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Anna Koren, who was here for training, right? I'm trying to find your bio. She's an assistant professor in anthropology department at St. Mary's College of California, specializing in the fields of linguistic and medical anthropology. Her research examines intersection between aging, embodiment, well-being, social interaction, and language. And she completed PhD here at UCLA.
Thank you. I think is this on? You can hear me. Okay. I'm going to move the T. Back here.
Not sure how to switch it on.
No, I have one on. So that's for the next. Okay, get it. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's so hard to sit all day. So if you want to just shake or something just to get woken up, I welcome you to do that. It's really, take a stretch, stand up, do whatever you need to do. Thank you for being here. Especially an hour earlier than maybe we intended to be here. I'm going to be talking about some of my ethnographic research. It's on successful aging and meaningful decline, and looking at comparative approaches, and looking at how this model of successful aging and versus the model of meaningful decline, how these bear out at the end of life, and the experiences people have. So let's just start here. How many of you, who's heard the term successful aging? Everybody, probably. Not everyone's raising their hand, but maybe everybody. What do you associate with it? Just yell it out. Health. Connection. Cognitive function. Relationships. Adaptation. Vitality. Being happy. Humor. That's nice. What's that? Independence. Gratitude, resilience. Yeah, these are all things that's great, that come to mind. And if you Google successful aging, if you just Google image it, you're going to get a lot of really happy looking people. Really happy looking people. And if you look on Amazon, so this idea of successful aging is really everywhere in our society right now. It's just embedding everything. And if you look on Amazon and you look for some books, there are some classic books. We're going to talk a little bit about Rowan Kahn today. So this first book on successful aging will come up. We'll get some academic texts. You'll get some sort of how-to texts. There's a lot of books. I've decided to live 120 years, sort of how to do this. Get healthy for your next 100 years. So this is by an MD, PhD. There are a lot of MDs in this world talking about how to do this, how to age well. Becoming ageless, the 4 secrets to looking and feeling younger than ever. Disrupt aging, this is the CEO of the AARP. A bold new path to living your best life at every age. The Longevity Paradox, another MD, how to die young at a ripe old age. And then this is amazing. There's even a book on how to age-proof your dog. The Art and Science of Successful Canine Aging. So if we think about what this paradigm replaces, before Rowan Kahn came out with this in the 90s, there was this, it can feel like a breath of fresh air. There used to be this paradigm that Achenbaum talks about of just decline and disengagement, this expectation that when you're aging, you're just going to get more and more decrepit and less sharp until you just die. So that's not a great model of aging. And so there's this cascade, there was this idea of this cascade into decline and disengagement. And the idea of successful aging really provides examples of aging where people are increasing in years, while maintaining health and well-being. So this feels, a lot better than what was coming before it. It's much more hopeful. And this shift has been accompanied by a surge of interest in communities where people are aging well into late life, where people really are successfully aging. And within this field of work, it's actually a pretty huge field of work, epidemiologists have found that elderly Catholic nuns age remarkably successfully. So they experience increased longevity. They are physically healthier at the end of life. They have fewer instances of Alzheimer's disease, as you see showcased here, and they report higher emotional well-being at the end of life than their peers. And as embodiments of this standard criteria of successful aging, these nuns are less impacted by disability or emotional burdens that often come with late life. And the nuns are often report being much less afraid of death than their peers. They maintain independence and physical mobility much longer than their peers. And a tremendous amount of research has gone into trying to understand their relative success. So what is it about these sisters that helps them age so well? So my work as an anthropologist in the past decade has been studying a community of sisters who age remarkably well. So for the past decade, I've been researching and writing about this group of Franciscan sisters who age more successfully than the rest of us. And my work has been looking at the linguistic and social factors that go into their remarkable aging patterns. So looking at what is it that they're doing every day that might actually contribute to these successful aging outcomes. But before I actually turn to my ethnographic work, I want to look a little bit closer at this successful aging paradigm, this idea of what it means to be successfully aging, what this term means and how it's defined. And so while this paradigm, as I said, it's much better than this kind of grim model that came before it, but anthropologists as well as critical gerontologists and some others have critiqued the model as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, this model of successful aging and the critique. So it was first coined by Robert Havighurst in 1997. So it's a fairly recent model. That idea came across very recently. And it was defined by Rowan Kahn in 97 in their book, Successful Aging, that you saw at the beginning, as avoidance of disease and disability, maintenance of high physical and cognitive function, and sustained engagement in social and productive activities. So a lot of this was represented in some of the things that you were saying at the beginning. And as anthropologist Sarah Lamb, a colleague of mine who I've worked with, and a number of others have pointed out, while these ideals that Rowan Kahn described for us are taken up widely in the fields of aging studies, gerontology, and then across all those popular literature that we saw, this actually reflects very specifically North American and European ideals of personhood, what it means to be a person in the world. So promoting certain actual cultural values of individual agency, control, productive activity, and this idea of independence, which actually came up in the beginning also. And indeed, Rowan Kahn talk about these cultural values in their work. So they say, our concept of success connotes more than a happy outcome. It implies achievement rather than mere luck. To succeed in something requires more than falling into it. It means having desired it, planned it, worked for it. All of these factors are critical to our view of aging, which even in this era of human genetics, we regard as largely under the control of the individual. In short, successful aging is dependent on individual choices and behaviors. It can be attained through individual choice and effort, So we see here some of these clear cultural values coming out in what they are saying for us, including these values of individual choice, of effort, of individual control. And what this highlights is that this paradigm, which dominates both the gerontology and popular discourse, it's really everywhere, is not only comprised of medical facts. It's about aging. It is not merely representing sort of neutral health findings. It is also promoting very specific North American cultural values, about particularly associated with neoliberal ideals of individual agency, independence, this idea of agelessness, of not declining. So this model, which articulates that each individual is in control of her own aging trajectory, it's this model where this idea that if you take all the right steps, you will arrive at longevity in this state of active, productive independence. But by promoting a model in which individuals are in control of their own aging success, oh, sorry, I had a second slide. That was longer than this is the rest of the Rowan Con. So by promoting a model in which individuals are in control of their own success, this paradigm inadvertently implies that decline is also our fault, is also in our own control. It must also be connected to our individual choices and actions. So this means that by promoting a model in which to successfully age means to never decline, this paradigm renders decline a moral failure, a real problem. And anthropologist Sarah Lamb has worked with this paradigm, and she writes that it produces a vision of the ideal person as not really aging at all in late life, but rather maintaining the self of one's earlier years. And sociopolitical critiques have pointed out that this is bound to neoliberal Western expectations for productivity and independence that are tied to capitalism, that are bound in this capitalistic society. So what I mean here is that these cultural values represent the values of capitalism, where we learn that to be good members of society, we have to be valuable members of society, we have to be productive, and we have to be productive, we have to be independent, and we have to contribute to society. So this model is often taken up as neutral science. If you go to the gerontology conferences, if you look at aging studies journals, it's promoted as if it's just sort of neutral science. And it's certainly promoted as if it's good. And certainly, I agree, it's better than this like inevitable decline into death that, we can't. But the successful aging model is actually not a scientific model. Instead, it is a cultural model that promotes cultural values. So what I don't mean that looking at positive health outcomes, that's scientific, to look at positive health outcomes. If you do this, you will have fewer chronic conditions. If that's science. But this stuff, all this stuff where we're looking at independence, productivity, this is a cultural model. So specifically, these cultural values that have been molded into all this work in gerontology and the aging studies, these promote this idea, these values of individual agency and control, independence, the maintenance of productive activity into the late years, and this idea of permanent personhood or sort of agelessness. And Sarah Lamb lays this out in 2014 in her work. And all of these slides are in a PDF, and you can get them online, and there are citations at the end if anyone is curious. So the successful aging model is not a neutral model in which gerontologists are just uncovering the science of positive health outcomes and longevity. It's actually emphasizing and promoting a certain cultural model of aging. So I'm going to reiterate again that this seems like it's unequivocally good. Like when we think about I want to be healthy, I want to be independent, who doesn't want those things in this room? Those things sound pretty good. But I think especially, and these things are particularly, we are Westerners. We have grown up, most of us, many of us, maybe not all of us, those of us who've grown up in the West, and I would say particularly those of us who exist in a middle-class cultural context, these seem like unequivocally good cultural values because there are cultural values. They're things that we don't see because they're our culture. You rarely can actually recognize your own culture. But these are not universal goals. cross-culturally. There are a number of communities across the world and also within the United States who don't hold these goals, who don't think these are the best ways to live. This idea of independent, all of these things, individual agency and control, all of these things are not necessarily ideals across the world or even across the US. And in fact, we might be in the minority with this idea, these ideas. So for example, in Western Bengal, in India, in the Western Bengal region of India, older people frequently talk about readiness for death. And this talk is not limited in any ways to those who are in a state of fragility or who are already declining. This is normal, even among robust, healthy adults, to talk about and anticipate readiness for death and decline. This is a normal, appropriate way to age in West Bengal. And just as in our cultural context, most of us think it's normal for a child to anticipate becoming an adult, and we prepare for that. So how many of you have asked a child in your life, you know, what do you want to do when you grow up? What are your interests? Where do you want to go to college? We think about that as a normal, as really normal for a child to think about their future going to a different developmental stage where they are an adult. This is true in other places in the world for end of life. It's a different developmental stage, and it's appropriate to anticipate it and get ready for it and think of it as different than active adulthood. So preparing for death and decline can be a normal, natural, appropriate way to become older, to anticipate developmental stages. And we don't have to look as far as India to find these communities. I would say, actually, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the blue zones, but I would say that Buettner's blue zones probably represent communities in which decline is seen as normative and something that's prepared for. I don't think he's done that ethnographic work, but I think it would be really cool to do that work. So returning to this idea, this model in gerontology, I'm going to suggest that there are two real problems with the successful aging model, this uncritical model of successful aging. So the first is that it's inaccurate. The very communities that are upheld as exemplars of successful aging, where we do see people having positive health outcomes at the end of life, they don't adhere to this model. There is, in fact, no evidence that the health outcomes that we associate with this model are tied to the cultural assumptions behind the model. So while this desire for health and happiness is absolutely universal, there's no evidence that these other things, these cultural values, independence, productivity, agelessness, avoidance of decline, are necessarily inherently connected in any way to health and happiness, these goals of health and happiness. And the second problem that I see with this model is that it produces negative experiences for older adults because it stigmatizes aging and it constructs decline as failure. So I would say that it actually can create experiences of suffering in people's lives. So let's just think for a minute. This is a room full of people who I think have witnessed people aging, have witnessed people at the end of life, have witnessed people in the dying process. How many of you have witnessed someone who was biking or skydiving into their late years? Their hair is, whipping in the wind. Their bodies are healthy and free of pain, and their minds totally sharp until they reach 90 or 100 or 110, and then without any chronic conditions, without declining, without painful deterioration, they just sort of went to bed one night and died in their sleep. I mean, I don't know those people. I have worked with these nuns for 10 years who are sort of one of the groups that is aging successfully. I've never met anyone who was like skydiving and active and ready and totally, and then sort of died in their sleep. Everybody I have known who is lucky enough to live into their late years, who has not died by an accident or something else, who has lived really long lives. Everyone I have known experiences some kind of chronic condition. they experience some kind of decline, some kind of change in their bodies, in their minds. And most of them have experienced pain also that has come with these changes. So every one of us actually will decline and meet death. So far, death is inevitable. It's not going to change. So there are, of course, there are some things that we have learned from gerontology and from this health aging about how this aging health sciences that can contribute to keeping our bodies and minds sound. Many of the things Dr. Lewirsky has talked about today. If we eat well, if we maintain physical activity, if we get enough sleep, if we are embedded in meaningful social networks, all of these things, if we meditate, if we all of these things can contribute to keeping our bodies healthy and maintaining well-being at any age, really, just like she was talking about, Dr. Lewirsky was talking about. There are certainly things also that we can do that can harm our bodies. I mean, if you smoke cigarettes every single day, if you do hard drugs, if you don't get enough sleep, if you eat unhealthy foods, these are not going to be healthy. These are not going to contribute to positive health outcomes. But even those who make all the right choices don't become invincible. I think we all know people who have exercised every single day, who ate right every single day, who still got cancer, who still declined, who still got Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, who still died. And I want to also take a moment to think about who has the opportunity to make these choices that Ro and Con talk about. These choices are opportunities that only some of us have the privilege to make. So if we think about those who grow up in extreme poverty, they're not going to have access to well-rounded diets or maybe smoke-free homes or these types of things. And if we think about the role of racism in health also, people of color are documented to receive poorer quality health care, to not be heard or treated with the same quality of care as their white peers. And there's strong evidence now that racism, just living with racism, encountering racism every day, has embodied negative health outcomes that manifest in chronic conditions. So just being a person of color in this country can increase one's chances of experiencing chronic conditions. So these are structural factors. These are not individual choices that people are making. And I totally see the appeal. Whenever we look at this type of work, it's so easy to say, like, to have a prescription, like, go eat better, or go do yoga. And those things do, that I'm not saying that doesn't have correlations with positive health outcomes, but that's a lot easier to do than to actually address the structural factors that might be impacting people, the structures of poverty, the structures of racism, these kind of bigger structural things. So just emphasizing this idea that not everyone actually has the choice to do what Ro and Con are prescribing, to make these individual choices that will lead us to successful aging. And I would hazard to say that this sense of suffering that comes with the successful aging paradigm actually impacts those of us who are aging well also. So I want just for a moment to think about the kinds of compliments that we give each other when we're aging. I've witnessed, for example, in retirement communities, two 75-year-olds, one saying to the other, "Oh my gosh, you look so young, you don't look a day over 50, you look great." And that might kind of feel good. Like, it feels good to get compliments. It definitely feels good to get compliments. But what does that do? What's the underlying message there? This question, well, what happens when I do look a day over 50? What happens when I do look my age? I've successfully masked who or where I am in my life course. Like, is that doesn't necessarily feel good ultimately. And then what happens if we do age or appear to age? So even these compliments, I think, reveal that the success itself of appearing not to age, it belies this denial, this specter of being seen, this fear of being seen of who you actually are or where in the life course you actually are. This isn't acceptance, you know, you don't look a day over 50. That's not acceptance of who you are. There's an underlying message there, that if you actually were revealed to be aging, that would be a problem, that you wouldn't get that compliment if you actually looked 75 when you are 75. So given that successful aging is neither a scientific model, these cultural values are neither a scientific model, nor something that actually brings much joy to us, it's important to know that there are other cultural models. This isn't the only way to do this. So my work draws on decades of ethnographic research within a community of older sisters in a Franciscan convent. And I find, indeed, these sisters experience remarkable health and well-being at the end of life. But the cultural models of aging, the way that they understand aging in the convent actually offers a counterpoint to the successful aging model. It's really different than what we see in the successful aging paradigm. So while the nuns are actually embedded, this is in the Midwestern US, they're embedded in Western society. They use, you know, Western medical facilities, Western medical care, and they're indeed remarkably productive, independent, and happy in old age. Their understandings of personhood, their understanding of time, their understanding of individual agency and control, their understanding of aging is really different than what we see in the successful aging paradigm. So, and in my work, I actually argue that the very reasons the sisters succeed so profoundly at the end of life, the reasons they have these positive health outcomes, might actually be tied to practices that contradict the cultural models in the successful aging paradigm. So specifically, I argue that the experiences of well-being that they report and have been documented may be increased precisely because they do not uphold this model of successful aging. So I'm going to organize the rest of the paper. We're going to spend the rest of my time looking at these ideals, how they understand aging, and then I'm going to show some data. We're going to get to look at a video of some of these sisters interacting. So first, let's the review of that again. So first let's think about individual agency and control. As members of a Catholic convent, these nuns, these sisters, take 3 vows: a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These are not actually the sisters I work with, but you will see some of them. They don't wear habits anymore. The vow of obedience is interpreted in the convent to have 2 meanings. The nuns are obedient to God, and they're obedient to institutional authority. So this is taken very seriously. And much of their lives were spent being immediately responsible. Every decision in their lives was dictated by these authorities. And when they were young, when these older sisters were young, this was before Vatican II, even minutiae of their lives were dictated by institutional authorities, like how much toothpaste would go on their toothbrushes, to what they ate at meals, to even profound things, who they were allowed to socialize with, where they would work, where they would go to either teach or nurse, or what field they would go into. Often they were just told, you're going to be a nurse or you're going to be a teacher, and they had to take that as an obedience. And there have been major institutional changes in the 1960s and 70s with Vatican II that changed the way obedience was understood and created more freedom in the sisters' lives. But most of these sisters that I was working with grew up most of their lives with this sense of obedience and this that they experienced, that I was describing. And this was designed, this is designed very specifically, just like for those of you who are familiar with Buddhism and the concept of emptiness in Buddhism, in Catholicism, this idea of kenosis, or emptying the self, is designed, it has very rich theological underpinnings. This obedience is not random. It's in order to strip them of the ego, and then they can fill themselves with God. So it breaks them down in some way. So they spend their lives developing a sense of lack of agency and control. And actually, I think that this supports them when they age. Because when they reach their older years, my ethnographic data show that they seem to understand illness and death as inevitable. And they accept these in the way that they accepted, okay, I'll put this much toothpaste on my toothbrush. Okay, you want me to be a nurse? I'm going to be a nurse. Okay. They accept these with serenity and a sense of peace, rather than the type of resistance or, in Buddhist lingo, clinging that we might see to other types of attachments. I don't see a lot of discouragement, denial, frustration when these kind of chronic conditions come. And I think that this sense that's practice, basically, that they've done all their lives of acceptance, accepting others' authority over them, actually helps them accept decline as they get closer to it. So second, we can look at independence. When the sisters join the convent, they commit themselves to a life of communal living. So they live in community, they eat, they sleep, they bathe in shared spaces. There's little emphasis put on independence and a tremendous amount of emphasis on communal living, living in harmony or interdependence. And although this paradigm of successful aging places a lot of value on how to live and function independently, epidemiological findings suggest that there's actually strong correlations between living in community and these health outcomes that are associated with successful aging. So this strong sense of community, of mutuality, of shared life really seems to also support the nuns as they age. And it may be informed by the fact that when they do transition into old age, when they do experience decline or chronic conditions, and they cannot function independently anymore, they can draw on this lifetime of experience living interdependently, of relying on each other. So they don't necessarily interpret dependence as moral failure or as a problem. So let's look at this third one, productivity. So the sense of community that we just spoke about actually relates to their notion of productivity. The nuns' vow of poverty requires that they turn all their funds, all their money over, all their earnings over to the convent, so they don't keep their personal earnings. They have a certain amount they can use, but everything they earn really is part of the community pool. And while a sense of service through action and material earnings is seen as valuable in the convent, service is extremely valuable, the community also provides a tremendous amount of socialization into this idea that being good is more important than doing good. And so they do not associate work and their material livelihood with their material livelihood, because they value being good as equal and above doing good. So they don't, therefore, seem to experience, a lot of us, when we retire, experience this sense of reduction in our value, our inherent value when we retire. If our value is put into being a professor or a doctor or a nurse or working as a teacher, and then suddenly we retire and we don't have that anymore, that can be really hard. But the nuns, even though they do incredible work, they don't seem to put their sense of value there. And so there's a lot of socialization and work that goes into that value. And as evidence of this, the sisters who were in the infirmary who could no longer work, I often witnessed other sisters coming by and thanking them for their prayers, just for their work. So even sisters who are sort of lying in bed, moaning, it's not clear that they were understanding what was said to them, they were thanked for their prayers. And this was understood as simply a process, their prayers not necessarily as verbal, but as simply being in the presence of God. And that was valuable. That was enough. And so this is a really different model than the model of productivity as seen as valuable. Finally, this idea of ageless adulthood. This Western notion of what it means to be a good person associates personhood with competent active adulthood. So in this model, children are seen as sort of on their way to being valuable, like they will be, but not quite yet, but they will be. And then older people are seen as on their way, moving away from personhood or valuable adulthood into decline. which is one reason we hang on to this idea of agelessness and not declining for so much. For the sister's, death, though, is not seen as an end point. It's rather seen as this transition from corporeality to another state, another mode of being, a continuum in life. And in the convent, personhood and the values associated with it are not associated just with adulthood. That's not the only time when life is important. This alternative view of personhood impacts how they treat themselves and each other in the infirmary, and this notion of life after death seems to reduce their fear of death. In addition, the notion that they maintain dignified personhood even after physical decline is evidenced in the way they interact with each other. So there's this idea that all stages of life are valuable. And of course we see this in the way that they understand life as beginning with conception, because Catholics understand life as beginning before someone is born. It also is connected to the way they treat people as they are after they have declined. So in the convent, I have witnessed a number of peer socialization interactions where they reinforce these values of acceptance, of interdependence, this idea that being good is more important than being productive or doing good, and the idea that all life stages are valuable. And this is manifested not only in these explicit modes of socialization, like where they say thank you for your prayers, or they will say, hey, being good, if someone's having a hard time retiring, or not being able to serve anymore, they will remind each other, being good is more important than doing good. Just be in the presence of God, that's what matters. So sometimes this socialization is really explicit. Other times it's much more embedded in the way, in their interactions. And there have been some structural changes in the convent, so there are an increasing number of nurses and aides because there's dwindling numbers of sisters now. But the demographics are changing. But the sisters still provide, in this convent that I worked in, a significant portion of the care, including feeding, social support, and pastoral care. And this care emerged as this sort of mutual, ongoing process. And the mutuality is really important. I'll explain that. So at first, these spaces that I was in, this convent infirmary, the assisted living wings, they resemble secular institutions that provide care for older adults, such as assisted living communities or nursing homes. But there are nevertheless these really significant structural differences. And one of these differences has to do with the fact that the sisters provide care for each other. So this is a participant framework, an arrangement or relationship between the participants that shapes the way they understand each other and what they're doing. So this framework is distinct from other institutional settings where the caregiver is paid to provide care. Most of you, I think, whether you're physicians or nurses or chaplains, were paid to provide care. This framework is really, in those settings, care is seen as unidirectional. You don't usually see your patients as caring for you. You usually it's one directional, you're doing the care. And it's often commodified. We pay our physicians for their work, and it's often emotionally fraught. It can be difficult. And in light of the successful aging paradigm, where successful aging is predicated on this idea that if you are successful, you are independent, you're in control, you're productive, and you're not aging at all, then care can actually become really problematic, because if you need care, because you are declining, because you are not independent, because you are not fully functioning, the actual need for care highlights the fact that the person requiring care has sort of failed to meet these hallmarks of successful aging. So care can become fraught because the successful aging paradigm sets us up to think that decline is a problem. And so if you're in the doctor's office, something's gone wrong. You've failed in some way. You're not aging successfully. So this can set us up for some really emotional problems, or it's a burden. So in the convent, care looks really different. Not only are the sisters not bound by 8 or 10-hour work days that dictate their care routines, but unlike institutional care facilities where the care provider is engaged in these services for pay, the care interactions were structured around meaningful interactions. And so they were seen as joint activities. So even if one of the sisters, for example, was massaging feet in order to get blood flow for sisters who couldn't walk anymore, that was seen as a form of prayer that was mutual. It wasn't one, I mean, she was doing this physiological work that's really important, getting blood flow, but it was not seen as me caring for you. It was seen, or her caring for this other sister. It was seen as a mutual engagement. They were in each other's presence. And I talk about this elsewhere, but I'm going to move on. So another distinction was that they would do these caregiving activities embedded in other meaningful activities. And one of these activities was card games. They would play card games. And any of you who know sisters who have played, know there's often a lot of card games in the evenings. In these evening card games are a really rich site to look at how care happened. And so I'm going to play you a video that captures 3 sisters playing cards. So one of these sisters, I call her Sister Helen. She's bent forward a bit. She has a deteriorative neurological disorder that has impaired her use of her body. She can no longer walk. She can move one arm, as you'll see, but she has really limited control of her fingers in that arm. Her body position, you can see, is limp. She's kind of hung over her chest. And she can grasp items, as you'll see, if they're handed to her, but she can't manipulate items. She can't feed herself. So, and she also has productive aphasia. So she can say and ah, but she can't articulate other words. And it seemed that she could understand what was said to her. So Sister Marie, who's the little flowers. Can you see that? Yeah, this is Sister Marie. She began caring for Sister Helen a few years before this was videotaped. They didn't know each other particularly well, but the person who had been caring for Sister Helen passed away. Sister Marie had retired. She couldn't do other work, and she saw a need in the community, so she just filled that need. So this represents kind of a pattern of, they see it was a pattern of sort of mutual care in the convent. And so they didn't know each other particularly well, but they had this dedicated relationship that was a lot based on her, Sister Marie, feeding Sister Helen every day and attending to her at multiple hours every day. And then almost every evening they would join others playing cards. So I'm going to, and in this interaction, we're going to see that Sister Helen's ability to communicate and her ability to hold and play cards is limited, but she's nevertheless engaged as a participant. So I want you to think about how decline, as you're watching this, how decline is incorporated in this interaction. So you will see that she is engaged in this card game. You'll see that she is able to participate to the maximum of her ability, and then the sisters will sort of step in and finish her actions and help her. So I want you to just look at this. There's crosstalk in the background because they're in a room with other sisters playing cards, so you'll hear that. The spoken language is less important than looking at how they're physically interacting with each other. Sister Marie will first say, she'll say, this needs a 9, this needs an 11. So she's saying things about the cards, what needs to be played on certain piles. So I'm going to play this, and hopefully the sound will work.
This needs an 11. This needs an 11. 6, 7, 8. This needs a 9. Needs a 9. Needs 11.
Yeah. Spade yours. If you don't have a spade,
She knows what to do, don't you worry.
save the day.
Susan, have you got a 9? Or a 5? Or a 2? Or an 11? You got an 11 down there.
Ooh, that's a heart.
Yeah.
Can't tell.
She plays
What
hard.
about diamond?
She already got it.
Oh, I don't have a heart.
You got a
Oh, you got a
9?
higher diamond over here. Oh, I have a heart. I must play, because I have got a 2 here. I can play here. Oh.
Oh, no, I'm not next.
A diamond? Oh, honey, thank you.
Oh, wow, you're so welcome.
Now you need a You need them.
Just let them have one.
Now you need to prove you a 10. You got a 10 here.
You got that one too? That's all right. You got them all. I can't believe you. I don't even
That's
have
okay.
all my luck. It was
That
all
won't
my
play,
luck.
Susan. You-
It's beautiful, isn't it? I love that moment where you kind of can't tell if she's all the way participating, and then she comes out with her card. And I think all the moments that happen before that are really important. Sister Marie says, that needs a 9, that needs an 11, that needs this. The things that she's doing scaffold the participation so that Sister Helen is able to maximize her participation. She's able to be the maximum, participate to the maximum of her ability. And so when she's saying this needs a 9, this needs an 11, and kind of pointing out these things, that's both drawing the group's attention to what needs to happen, but it's also, and it's scaffolding the cognitive process. Scaffolding the cognitive process, allowing her to sort of be aware of what's really needed there. It's also scaffolding the time process. She's moving a little bit slower than other people might be moving, or her peers right there are moving. And so by providing that, she's allowing her more time to start the action and complete the action. I won't spend much time really talking about all the things that are done in here. It's really cool. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, so I love thinking about all the little things that they're doing to maximize that participation. Like when she blocks that card, when she says that won't play, the way that she blocks the card, just putting her hand there, allows Sister Helen to correct course. And so there's all these ways in which her agency, her ability, her autonomy is kind of maximized so that she can participate as a valued member of this community. She is not segregated in some room sort of just watching TV and being fed and whatever. She is part of the community, even though she has declined. So these interactions, this really short clip reveals this model of participation in which Sister Helen and her peers were engaged in a shared project, this project of the card game, and care emerges here in this context where Sister Helen is this valued participant. And I think it's really worth noting that Sister Helen, if we're thinking about these hallmarks of successful aging, and when we think about, our skydiving elders, and the covers of all those books, How to Live My Next 100 Years, this is not the image of successful aging, right? She has severely limiting chronic conditions. She has neurological deterioration. She has aphasia. She is impacted by decline in very significant ways. But what is significant here in this community is that even these sisters who are markedly declining are taken up as valued participants in meaningful everyday activities, even when they are no longer independent or active or productive. And that's both important for the sisters who are declining and for everyone else who is anticipating aging, who is thinking about that transition and what that transition into older age is going to feel like for them. If you imagine being segregated and having to leave your CCRC or your assisted living communities because you need more care than can be provided, that's one way of looking at your future. But if you know that you're going to be included no matter what, that's a really different way of looking at that life stage. So, in conclusion, these sisters are heralded as successes within the successful aging paradigm. They're a cover of Time magazine. However, I hope to have shown today that actually the sisters' experience of physical and mental well-being might actually be supported by the fact that they don't uphold the cultural ideals of the successful aging paradigm. So I've shown that they locate control and agency outside of themselves. They're used to giving up control and agency. Others are in charge, God in their view, or institutional authorities. They have a sense of cultivated interdependence. They value being good, not productivity. And they value all life stages, including decline. And all of this, I think, supports their well-being. Furthermore, so first, this brings me just to reiterate that these health outcomes that are associated with successful aging, they are not tied to the cultural ideals that come with successful aging. These two things are separate. Second, by presenting successful aging as an achievement that one will earn through hard work, we inadvertently blame those who, by no fault of their own, encounter chronic conditions, pain, cancer, Parkinson's, dementia, heart disease, and death. We also know that stress and poor self-image correlate with negative health outcomes. There's a ton of research on this. So if the successful aging, not the negative aging paradigm, the successful aging paradigm is mobilized in a way that asks people, that allows people to have negative feelings about decline, then that in fact might cause or be correlated with negative health outcomes. That can't be good for our bodies, to be judging ourselves when we decline. So I think we need to be really careful about how we mobilize this successful aging paradigm. And while positive health outcomes, I mean, we all want positive health outcomes. I have no problem. That is universally desirable. Let's not adopt a paradigm that is not only inaccurate, but also stigmatizes decline, because that's not going to get us to the positive health outcomes. And I'd like to suggest that instead, more like the sisters, we adopt a model that includes meaningful decline. And so I'm going to end actually with a couple of questions. So if meaningful decline is represented in communities that are aging gracefully, that have these positive health outcomes, and is perhaps connected, key to the health and happiness we see at the end of life in these communities, how might we integrate these values of meaningful decline into our medical spaces, into our institutional settings? I think we have some models for this. I think that there's a lot of work in hospice and palliative care that is doing this really well. But I think we need to start a lot earlier, much, much earlier. So I'll ask you, what would it look like if meaningful decline were a shared cultural value, something we taught to our children, for example? What would that look like? How might we get there? I don't have the answers, but I can say, first of all, that it's possible. This exists in other communities. It exists with the sisters. It exists around the world in other cultural communities. It exists within the United States. It's possible. People do this work. And second, if that's a choice, we as a culture, we as a group, as a society decide to make, it's going to take a lot of work. If we really want to embrace meaningful decline, we're going to have to look hard at how we think about aging, how we face illness, and perhaps we're going to have to accept that unlike our Enlightenment philosophers, unlike the medical and scientific models that we're really embedded in, that in fact a lot of life is really mysterious. I think that accepting decline and death as a normal part of life and honoring them will mean accepting that there are some things that are not really known, some things that are bigger than us, some things that are outside of our control, but also potentially really beautiful as well. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you. I really appreciated your talk. I'm a hospice chaplain, and in answer to your question about meaningful decline, no, I think that in order for it to begin a lot earlier, it needs to begin with all of us, the caregivers, because there are a lot, as a hospice chaplain, a lot of times the patients come in the day before they die. Sometimes the physicians also, their model is to save and to heal the patient. So in some ways, they're also saying, I have to give up on this patient. And so the acceptance of the fact that we all face death is something really essential. I also asked, and this is really quite meaningful to me, and I was a Buddhist nun for 27 years, so I lived in communities in India in the past also. And I asked one of my teachers about, the monks facing end of life, because and the Tibetan monks live in exile. They have been since 1959. He said, I've never seen the monks be anxious about decline and end of life, even among the ordinary monks. And I believe it is because, one of the first teachings is that everything is impermanent and death is inevitable. And so it was really a confirmation of hearing that. So, and I think, the nuns having this kind of strong sense of communion is also because they know where they're going to age, where they're going to be, where they're going to be sick and die. And that gives them a sense of surety that we don't have a lot of times in the ordinary community, and with this model of successful everything. That so it was a really nice affirmation for my own experience and work. And so, but I was wondering, because there's the challenge of the breakdown in the hierarchy and the institutional authority that's going on everywhere in monastic communities, not only in the Catholic community. So how that impacts the sense of belonging and discouragement with the system, when you've dedicated your life to, obedience to God and the institution, when the institution is falling apart. So I was wondering if you had some reflection on that.
Yes, so before I answer that question, I will respond. Thank you for this, your reflection and your experience, and I wanted to comment on what you said about the knowing where you're going. One thing that reduces a sister's experience of anxiety, I think that I'm excited that Dr. Grob will be talking at 11:30 about the psilocybin trials, because I think that's a really neat space where people who don't have a sense of religious or theological sense of the afterlife are nevertheless feeling like, there's research that has found that just knowing that the worms are going to get to you and crawl in and crawl out, that through this particular trials and done in a particular way is enough to reduce those. So I think that's a really neat space of looking. It doesn't have to be through religious institutions or theological established theologies. In terms of the change, I think there's so much going on in terms of the changes that we shall see. I mean, the sisters that I worked with, these are Franciscan sisters who saw huge changes. There are some things that just brought them a lot of joy. I mean, there are some things about the democratization of the institution that brought them a lot of joy, that have been unequivocally, I think, seen as really good. There are some other things that I see, they're less required to adhere to these practices of giving up, of non-attachment. So I think it will be interesting to see where that goes. I mean, I think we don't know yet, but it's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for your presentation. I actually work with nuns. I own a private geriatric care management company, and I'm a licensed MFT. And I'll never forget the first time I was asked to see this one nun who had suicide attempts. And I was like, what? How can that be in the same sentence? I was really surprised. But my work is working on the mental illness piece and major neurocognitive decline of nuns. But my question that I wanted to bring up to answer your question about how we as a community, because I think the communal living with sisters is what keeps them going on a lot of levels. Is that, I'm 50 years old and I struggle with, should I let my hair grow out gray? And I don't like the wrinkles on my forehead. Should I do Botox? And I struggle, I think as a society, and especially in major cities where everyone's looking the way they look, it's hard to make meaning out of how do you balance both. So I think it's going to be a huge societal, universal shift to not want to look like you're on the cover of Vogue or something. So, but thank you. I love your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question that I don't know that there is an answer, but this idea of successful aging, are they in agreement on when aging starts? And I say that tongue in cheek, right? Because obviously we're continuously aging, but it seems like at a certain point, oh, you're aging so well. Well, thank you very much. I've been aging well all along. So, but when they talk in these books, is there a sense of, well, now you've started to age, so it can be determined if it is successful or not? I mean,
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, no, I mean, I think there's like tremendous debate, and I think that there's not like an agreed upon time. I mean, it depends on who you ask. People in human development will have sort of certain outlines of when typically certain things start, like when does menopause start, when does this start, but when are you successfully aging, that's more measured in like big demographic outcomes, like people at 90 have X number of chronic conditions, or whatever. So as far, and maybe anyone can correct me, but that's sort of, I don't see it as like, I think it's a mess because I don't think the idea of successful aging is really operationalized in a particularly key way.
One last question
So I'm a Parkinson's neurologist, and I'm interested in palliative care and integrative medicine as well. So I see a lot of aging couples and single people. I run our Center of Excellence at the VA, actually, in Parkinson's. Two comments. So one is a lot of those pictures that you put up, I think some of them are actually from ads for medications for, dementia, psychosis, and things like that. So I think that we, in some ways, as a medical community and pharmaceuticals and et cetera, propagate this notion of these couples, and I've actually, they're direct to patient marketing and, sell a story that I think is quite implausible and kind of stressful to kind of try to, enact. So I think that's one comment. The second is that I'd be interested to see, I think the nuns are so interesting and such a rich kind of population with so many controlled variables in some ways, right? Like she said about, knowing where you're going to be, who's going to be taking care of you. It's, there's not like a financial worry, who's going to be, where's my next meal coming from? Am I going to be, kicked out of my, home or wherever, and what's the future hold? But another thing that I think is not necessarily told about in this story is a lot of women, especially as they age, end up being caregivers for men. And I think that in my practice, at least, single women who are above the age of 80 often thrive just as single women because they're not having to be that caregiver. So I think that is not really told, and I think it would be interesting to see a control population of women that are aging well in the community that may have connections to other women that may not be in this controlled sort of universe, but I think that those women actually do very well. And men who are married, who are older, who have caregivers that are women, often do well too. So that's a good prognostic indicator of your man. If you're a woman, not so much, to be married. So I think that's kind of an interesting, sort of thing that is not told out, sort of. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great comments. Thank you. I think that, and the role, like you're saying about the marketing for pharmaceuticals, so the role of capitalism in general, the role of who's benefiting, who's making a profit off of this successful aging model, that's a really important question. Like where some of these messages are coming from places that are, when we dye, if we dye our hair, we're buying that, we're purchasing that. There are some of these are connected into sort of models of profit. And then absolutely, I think that there are real gender components for lay folks, especially heterosexual couples. Yeah, just as you said, men benefit far more from care than women end up doing towards late life. So those are great comments. Thank you.
Aging now is a big business, and I met with young entrepreneurs for Successful Aging Group here, and they're popular, they're in every major city trying to figure out what kind of business can be derived from catering to this population. It's becoming more prominent. Provigen doesn't save your brain, but it's a big business if you watch television. So anyway, we have to move on. And thank you so much. Amazing, amazing.